of Discovering Buddhism called Wisdom of Emptiness. So let's go ahead and start with a few prayers. We've been, last time we recited the Heart Sutra. I think it's kind of nice to recite that for this particular set of teachings. It's kind of one of the shortest sutras that the Buddha did on emptiness. And so we can kind of refresh our own understanding of this, whatever that might be, or if you don't have much understanding of it, try to use these words to gain an appreciation for this topic of emptiness that we'll be studying. I prostrate to the Arya Triple Gem. Thus did I hear at one time the Bhagawan was dwelling on Massive Vulture's mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagawan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element and so on, up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly, completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared: Tayata Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhi Soha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagawan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagawan having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvatiputra, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagawan. We'll do the short mandala offering. Again, just imagining a vast pure offering, this world transformed into a beautiful pure land. And we're making this offering to our gurus, to the Buddhas, so that we can achieve the realizations that they have and we can become just like them. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun, and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then refuge in bodhicitta before the teaching, giving ourselves a chance to articulate these 2 thoughts of finding safe direction in the 3 jewels of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And then in the last 2 lines, cultivating the motivation of bodhicitta for engaging in these teachings. So we'll recite this once in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyen gi pe sanam gi drola penshir sangye drupar shog sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyen gi pe sanam gi Dorla Penchir Sangye Druparsho. Okay, thank you, Mary. So let's go ahead and do a short meditation, give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit and to generate a good motivation, a bodhicitta, kind of make that a bit more firm in our minds. So again, most of you have an awareness of meditation. We're going to talk about that today, actually. That's kind of a prelude to going into the teachings on emptiness, is to talk a bit about calm abiding and how we attain that. And of course, one of the ways that we do that is through focusing the mind on the breath or some other object. And so if you have a technique that you already use to do that, then by all means, just feel free to use that for the next few minutes. If you need a suggestion, as usual, I suggest working with the area around the nostrils. Seems to be an easier one for people to work with in terms of attending to that sensation that occurs as you breathe in and out, and just making that your meditation object. And we'll talk about this today, kind of the factors that can distract the mind. But when we do find that the mind has wandered away from the breath, the job at that time is to notice that, to let go of whatever it was that distracted you and come back to the breath. So I will ring the chime to begin the meditation period. We'll do a few minutes in silence, and then I will do a short reflection on bodhicitta before we begin the class. So now let's set our motivation for today's class, and we can recall the analogy that I used last week to talk about why we need to engage in these teachings on emptiness and concentration that we'll be doing today. Recall that we have this tree of samsara that we are all involved in, each of us, the creators of our own experience, this samsaric experience that is unsatisfactory, although it does have positive fruits as well as negative fruits in terms of the things we experience. Those are all rooted in ignorance. They are all part of this process of continually going from life to life under the control of our karma. And of course, the delusions, the states of mind that produce those actions that we engage in. And whether these be positive actions or the negative actions, as I said, they're all rooted in ignorance. As long as we are blind to the nature of reality, as long as we don't know the wisdom of emptiness and develop it at a very deep level, we'll continue to be in this state. We will grasp at things as inherently existent, existing from their own side. And on the basis of that, we'll go on to develop various deluded minds. And even, again, the virtuous minds that we develop will still be tainted by that ignorance. So first, develop a motivation that involves yourself. This is where everything begins, is wanting freedom from ignorance for yourself, to know the peace that will come when you are liberated from all the causes of samsara, everything that leads you to continue to have this unsatisfactory experience. But moreover, we engage in these teachings in the Mahayana tradition with the mind of bodhicitta that recognizes that if we go beyond our own individual liberation and attain the state of Buddhahood, we will then not only attain our own welfare, but we will be in the best position to benefit others, to help them to know this wisdom of emptiness, to be free from this tree of samsara, all the varied experiences that are conditioned in this way. So unite your own mind that aspires for that for yourself with the mind that aspires to achieve the goal for the benefit of others, the goal of Buddhahood, where we then, in that perfect state, will be able to help others to the greatest ability to develop concentration, to develop wisdom, to develop all the qualities that they will need to actualize their potential, to try to hold that motivation of bodhicitta, so that what we do here today becomes a cause for that ultimate result of our own enlightenment and the enlightenment of all beings. Okay, wonderful. Again, thank you all for joining today. And what we're going to do today, as I mentioned in the last week's class, as well as on our little course outline, again, all the materials should be available through the website, TNL's website, the same place where you went to link to today's class probably. And just know that today is going to be just a single class looking at concentration. I will probably talk about concentration more. We haven't decided for sure what I'm doing at the Sunday teachings in the new year, but we may continue on with the perfections and talk a bit more about concentration in the context of that series of classes. But today's class is to look at these teachings that help us to develop this much more stable mind, this mind that can then be used as a platform for realizing emptiness very deeply. And so again, these are teachings that can become a little technical at times, but nonetheless, I'll try to keep it as relevant to your own experience as much as I can. Next week, we will go on then to look more at the detailed teachings on emptiness and really discerning how we come about realizing that topic. But we need a very stable mind in order to accomplish that. Recall that in basic Buddhist meditation, as it's taught in this tradition, we can say there are two types of meditation. The one is what we're going to be discussing today, which is what we call our stabilizing or placement meditation. It's what we just did with the breath. It's where we take the mind and try to focus it on a single object, to develop what we call our single-pointed concentration, meditative stabilization. There's lots of different terms for this. The Sanskrit for this is samadhi, the ability to be single-pointedly focused on something. But in order to cultivate that, obviously we need to address some of the obstacles. So we're going to look at that as part of today. But this is, evident in our own minds. We don't have minds that are very stable, that are very mindful. And so we lose track of things very quickly. Suddenly we're aiming in one direction to do something, and then something else pops into our mind and we go off in another direction. We need a much more stable, focused mind in order to achieve any of the realizations, much less the wisdom of emptiness. So this is a very important part of our practice, is stabilizing meditation. The second type of meditation, we have this fancy word for it, analytical meditation, but it's essentially thinking. It means reflecting, and of course it becomes much stronger the further down the path we go. It's not, as conceptual as much as it is focusing on those things that we know and have discerned through our analysis. But our analysis is a key part of our practice as well. And these might seem to be diametrically opposed. When we stable the mind, we try to let go of all the distracting conceptual overlays and what have you, and to be less conceptual. Whereas when we think in our analytical meditation, we are obviously being much more conceptual. But nonetheless, these two can be brought together into a very powerful mind. So the mind of stabilizing meditation, that gets developed into this state that we call calm abiding. And these two words have an interesting, kind of connotation to them. Calm, of course, means that the mind is no longer distracted and, kind of caught up in various things. It has been pacified. But abiding means that you can actually retain that you can stay in that state with this intense sort of clarity. So it's a very focused mind. It's a very powerful mind that we're aiming to develop. And that all starts with what we do right now in terms of our everyday practice of spending some period of time focused on the breath or some other object of meditation. We'll talk about objects of observation shortly. But this is an important development, is to kind of take that all the way to this place that we call calm abiding. The term in Sanskrit for that is shamatha, and you might even hear the Tibetan occasionally of shine. Shine is literally peace, she, and ne, abiding. So it's peaceful abiding, calm abiding. This is the connotation of that mind. On the other hand, the analytical meditation that we're engaging in now, many of you hopefully are doing some analysis of the Lam Rim topics as part of your meditation. Maybe you stabilize the mind a little bit like we did at the beginning of class, and then you introduce a topic of the Lam Rim that you meditate on. It's where Discovering Buddhism has meditations that we distribute for each week, for people to use in their practice. That analytical meditation, again, is going to feel a bit discordant compared to what we're trying to do in focusing the mind over here. But we use this as a way of bringing the teachings home, helping us to develop our own experience with the teachings. So it's a very crucial part of our practice. And we could hang out over here just watching the breath all day in meditation. That's going to be wonderful in terms of calming the mind, but it's not going to change the sort of fabric of your mind by virtue of helping you to develop these realizations. But you need that calm abiding in that stable mind over here in order to develop this to a greater degree. This gets developed, just as the stabilizing meditation gets developed into calm abiding, the analytical meditation gets developed into what we call special insight. The word in Sanskrit is vipassana. And you might even hear vipassana retreats and so on. They are a form of an analytical awareness of what's going on in the mind and so on. It's not quite the same as meditating on emptiness, but it's the same fundamental idea of analyzing and being aware of what's happening and altering things, changing things as needed. But anyway, in our special insight, we're mostly talking about there in our Buddhist development of that mind is to develop the insight into emptiness, which is what, again, we're going to deal with in the remainder of this course. So we want to develop a deep understanding of emptiness, one that's no longer conceptual, and that actually becomes a direct realization of emptiness. This is the goal on the Buddhist path, at least one of the main goals that we want to get to. In order to do that, we have to have a union of these two minds. We have to have this very stable mind of calm abiding or concentrations that are even higher than that, that are even subtler than that. But essentially, this level of mind, where the mind can remain sort of focused and very vibrant, intense, together with the direct insight into emptiness. And when we are able to unite those, we call that a union of calm abiding and special insight. You can do this with a conceptual idea of emptiness, but eventually you want to lose the conceptuality and develop a direct insight into that. So our conceptual minds are always knowing things through an idea, through an image. This is the nature of conceptuality. You know, when I ask you to think about your mother's face, for example, your mother of this lifetime, think about her face. You're bringing to mind her face in an image or an idea of what it is. It's not her actual face. Her actual face is, if you do get the good fortune of still being able to see your mother, then you can go see your mother and have that experience of actually seeing her face. But in terms of the conceptual mind, we always are working with an idea of something. We do this with not just visual objects, but we do this with sound, with taste. If I asked you to think about the taste of strawberry right now, you can bring that to mind, and you're not tasting strawberry. Again, we're always knowing in an indirect way. Well, this conceptual idea of emptiness that we're going to be working on in the remaining classes is the starting point, because it gets us into the arena of getting an understanding of what this object is that we want to know. But that conceptual framework has to fall away at some point. And we have to have a mind that actually knows emptiness in a non-conceptual format. To ever get to that, we absolutely need this other development of meditation. As I said, you have to develop that all the way to calm abiding. You have to be able to develop your analytical mind to special insight, unite the two, and it's still going to be conceptual at this point. But then eventually, through your repeated meditation, you develop a direct insight through your union of calm abiding and special insight. So this is the goal. Now, what I'm going to talk just a little bit more about meditation before we go into the more details around developing calm abiding. But in your daily meditation, I'm just reiterating advice that I've given before. I even gave it, I think, when I taught Module 8, was that you want to first do your stabilizing meditation. You know, and this is a good part of our practice, again, just to make sure that we are free of as much distraction as we can. Then we introduce our analytical meditation. But our analytical meditation is always to get us to a point of, if you're meditating on compassion, for example, and thinking about the suffering of yourself and others, well, then when you get to the place where you're feeling compassion, then you want to focus on that and let go of the analysis and go back to a stabilizing meditation, but not on the breath, in this case, on compassion, on the feeling of compassion, the thoughts of compassion that have informed that emotion in your heart. Now, with emptiness, the wisdom of emptiness, what we want to be doing is we stabilize the mind for a bit. We do our analysis, which again is what we're going to go into next week and beyond. And when we get to a place where we kind of are getting an inkling of what emptiness is, where you're kind of having that feeling that the I, the self, this person, which was, by the way, the meditation I encouraged you to work with, was to begin to feel some sort of idea of how we think about this I. When we begin to see that this I doesn't have that mode of existing at all, that kind of falls away and we see the lack of that. That's what we would then want to focus on. So then you go back to your stabilizing meditation and sort of focus on that. So these two, we want to get in the pattern of using them in conjunction with each other, rather than, oh, here's my period of time when I'm doing just stabilizing, and then over here I'm doing analysis. We want to get to the conclusions that analysis is driving us towards and then go back to stabilizing on that. Then when that begins to wane and we lose the power of that, then we go back to analysis to refresh our understanding of it. And then when we get to it again, we go back to stabilizing. Is everyone clear about this concept? Anyway, this is just to give you a little preview of, again, what we're going to be looking at in terms of the analytical techniques. That is the remainder of this course, to get us to really be clear about how do we discern this nature of reality, that things are lacking this particular way of existing, which once more is the antidote to our ignorance, and it is what will allow us to attain enlightenment for the sake of others. So today we're going to mostly focus on this stabilizing meditation and how do we go about the process of developing it to calm abiding. And some of you may look at that and say, well, you know, especially after you hear all of today and go, oh my gosh, I could never do that. Again, recall that this is something that we need to maybe get over. This is actually said to be a form of laziness. We all can develop our minds this way. It just takes great effort. It just takes doing the work. You know, so know that this is possible for all of us to do this. We just, again, have to put our attention into it. So let me go ahead and share the slides that give a recap of everything I'm going to talk about today, and then I'll kind of keep coming back to that in terms of keeping me on track. So um, the first one I already talked about, types of meditation and their advanced forms. So we talked about, again, stabilizing and analytical. Their advanced forms for stabilizing is calm abiding, this term that we use to refer to that. And then special insight for the advanced form of our analytical meditation, especially again in relation to emptiness. Let's go into the 6 essential causes for achieving calm abiding. This is kind of a good way to get in the ballpark of talking about this because we do recognize that it's very difficult to achieve this mind if these causes aren't in place. Now, again, we're going to go into this in more detail in terms of the individual things, but know that there are other factors that also contribute to this. For example, having teachings about attaining calm abiding, even having practiced some measure of this before going into some formal way of developing it. That's why Geshe Sherab always emphasizes that one of the most important things is having a continuity of practice every day to do some amount of meditation. Even if you go, oh my gosh, my day is just so full, I've got so much going on, all I can manage is 5 minutes, then do 5 minutes. That's perfectly fine. Don't feel like you have to, just throw it out the window if you can't do any, or if you can't do very much. If you can't do very much, just do a little, but always do a little every day. Always do some amount of meditation so that you keep the continuity of practice. You're always always putting a drop of water in the bucket. Eventually the bucket will get full. If you kind of go days, weeks, months without doing any meditation, then you don't have that continuity. You don't have the strength of that practice. So this is an important part of it that isn't mentioned in these 6 causes, but nonetheless is important for us to be aware of. Let me go to the actual handout that you have that's this one here. I was going to talk about this kind of at some point. Maybe I'll just let it go for now. Well, these are again these various realms of samsara. Last week we talked about this tree of samsara, and I mentioned that in the meditation. Do know that these two, sometimes you hear this term, sometimes the 3 realms, the Buddhas of the 3 realms, or the beings of the 3 realms, whatever. The 3 realms are on the left, and that's when we look at this idea that there are 2 realms that are actually rebirths in those realms are generally taken through the force of meditative concentration. And so when you develop these various concentrations and what are called the formless absorptions, you can actually take rebirth in these much more blissful states, but they are not an end in and of themselves. Nonetheless, beings do take rebirth there when they've developed these various levels of concentration and absorptions. But the desire realm, of course, is where we are all at in the human realm, which is sometimes they talk about the 6 realms of existence instead of the 3. And that's where these 6 are, and they include all the beings of the form and the formless realm in the God realms in that case. They say that these are gods of the form realm and gods of the formless realm. They're not gods in the way that we think about God in the Judeo-Christian tradition. They are rather beings who have an elevated state of existence whereby they don't experience so much suffering. So again, this was just to show you that there are even states of existence that when you develop calm abiding and even some of these concentrations that go beyond that, the absorptions that go beyond the concentrations, which are called the absorption of limitless space, infinite consciousness, and so on, that you can develop this sort of karma. It's a form of karma that allows you to take rebirth in those very realms, which of course is not why we develop them. We don't want to take rebirth necessarily in these realms. We want to use it as a means of developing our concentration, our ability to focus on things. So that was, again, it's on the chart because sometimes when I do a longer presentation on this, I bring a little bit more awareness to what goes on in that idea of realms of existence that can even be products of your meditation. So we'll go to chart 2, which is, again, if you have this is one of the handouts that's out on the website. I'm going to keep this up there as I talk about these 6, maybe occasionally take it off, but essentially this is the 6 essential causes for achieving calm abiding, which, as I said, are not comprehensive, but they are really talking about when we are making a decision to be more engaged in this practice through the force of our having done this for a while, but wanting to make greater progress. It is important that we have all 6 of these in place. The first one is recognizing that we have to have a favorable environment. And this is usually delineated as one that has what are called here the 5 conditions. Now, if we're doing this again on a retreat basis, which is often how people do it, I think Venerable Rene, who I will mention here and there, he's a wonderful monk in our tradition, a Swiss monk who has developed, in my estimation, some pretty powerful concentration. And he's done these longer retreats where you actually develop the mind to these degrees. Anyway, he says that it is possible for people to practice calm abiding in their everyday meditation, perhaps even to attain it. But I think it's very challenging. I mean, most of us don't have the favorable environment to begin with, right? We not just talking about our own home or place. The idea is that we also have lives that we're living that keep us off the cushion doing other things that are distractions for us, that it's very hard to get back to the cushion and bring the mind back to that place. Whereas if you're in a retreat environment where that's all that you're doing, of course you're eating and sleeping and what have you, but you're essentially trying to do this practice of maintaining your awareness of a single object and so on, trying to develop calm abiding, this stabilizing meditation. Well, then, it's much easier, right? Because you don't have all that distraction. But there are things that we can do and take from this list. This first one's about that more favorable environment that we need to have to develop this. But we can take away some things that we might be able to practice right now, even though we're not yet in that environment that we would see to be perfect. The first is that, of course, it should be ideally a place where necessities such as food, water, and clothing are, easily obtained, a place where, we can have access to those things. Of course, in retreat, it is ideal to eat simply, to not eat so much even. This keeps the mind a bit sharper, rather than the dullness that comes when we eat a lot of food. But we need to have healthy things to sustain us while we are in our meditation retreat or what we are trying to engage in here. It also should be a wholesome and safe place, free from danger and harmful interferences, because of course these things will upset the mind, will, cause us to have harm to our meditation and so on. It also, ideally, they don't mention this in that second point, but it also is good if it's a place that has been blessed by past meditators, especially like your own teachers, gurus, those who have meditated there before. Um, so again, just keep that in mind. Obviously, we don't have the ability right now with everything going on with COVID to look at going to various parts of the world where in India or Nepal where great beings have meditated and trying to develop our meditation there. But if you do get serious about engaging in a more concentrated practice and retreat, it's good to keep all of these things in mind. Of course, even with regard to our own homes, to what degree are we free from, harmful interferences? Do we have crazy neighbors in the apartment next door or in the house across the way that are, causing us to feel some unease in our own homes? That would be obviously something that could be a factor that could diminish our ability to develop some concentration. The third factor, a healthy location where you will not be subject to dampness and other conditions that can cause illness. Again, where there's lots of fresh air, even good views, a moderate climate. Sometimes they say a cooler environment is better for meditation because the hotter environment does have a tendency to make the mind much more sluggish. So they say generally like places like in Tibet where you have these caves at higher elevations and very cool environments, those can be very useful. But again, don't feel like that is something that you have to find right now. But keep that in mind again if you're looking at a place for longer retreat. A place with helpful and conducive companions at hand. Of course, many people go into solitary retreat to do this type of retreat, but for beginners especially, which I can't help but emphasize enough, it is very important that we try to have other people that we're practicing with. That's why they do these, even in the Vipassana tradition, they do 10-day retreats with huge groups of people. Of course, nowadays, again, that's not happening with what's going on in our world. But when things open up again, it's good to get some experience doing retreat with a larger group of people, or at least, a number of people, so that you don't um, feel like you're completely on your own, not knowing what's going on, not knowing what to do, no one else to talk to. That can be a bit of a challenging experience initially. When you've done a number of retreats on your or with other people, then you can look to do retreats on your own. But it is good if you do have people who can support you even in your practice if you are doing retreat somewhat on your own. Most of our centers that have retreat cabins, they still have the rest of the community living in the space, but the retreat cabins are a bit more isolated. But if you have access to teachers that you can go to, especially if you have access to your own guru, that would be wonderful. It's good to have someone that you can know with what's going on in your retreat, with your practice, to kind of check in with them and see, is this good, is this bad? Because sometimes people do have different experiences in their meditation when they start going deeper, and they might think, oh, this is a really bad sign, but maybe it's a good sign, So we hopefully have studied enough to know what's happening at various levels, but nonetheless, it's good to have people that we can rely on for support when we're going into that depth of practice. The last one is a location well suited for yogic practice, free from commotion and noise. Again, this is something that maybe is reflected a little bit even by the second point of a, kind of a wholesome place safe from dangers. But here the idea is that, we don't want a lot of people gathering during the day, creating noise. Like at Vajrapani, the retreat cabins are kind of up above where the other people come to do courses and what have you. And they generally advise people who are doing courses not to be so loud, because up in the retreat cabins, some of that noise does carry over there. It's best if you can do this in a place where you don't have so much commotion and noise. And of course, if you're doing this type of retreat, unlike some of the retreats that we might do at TNL that are at the center or what have you, you don't bring your devices, you don't bring your computer to check your email every day, you don't bring your phone so you can talk to friends, while you're in between sessions. You leave all of that commotion and distraction behind. You don't, if ideally, if you're going to do a retreat that's a number of months, then you don't have any involvement with the outside world. You're not monitoring your bank account and paying your bills and doing all these things. You have that taken care of for you. Have someone else who can maintain control over what's going on in your life so that you don't have to be engaged in all of that. This is where, if we're really trying to focus the mind, all of this is going to impair our ability to do that. So it's important that we have all these conditions in place to the greatest possible degree, recognizing again that other things may come up, but nonetheless, this is what really constitutes a favorable environment. The second point on here, having few wants and maybe we'll talk about the two of these, and being content. You might think, oh, well, these sound kind of the same. Having few wants means that we don't have a mind that craves what we don't have. Being content means a mind that is content and satisfied with what we do have. So again, we don't want to bring in, tons of stuff that can be distracting for us. We want to maybe bring a few Dharma books, especially if you're doing a meditation retreat where you're focusing on developing calm abiding, perhaps some instruction books that help you to refresh your memory of all of that. But you really don't want to bring in, your favorite novels or whatever, or a brand new novel that you're going to get into and whatnot. You're not going to want to have this mind that is continually seeking to have something that you desire, that you want. And of course, being content with the meager food, the simple food and clothing, accommodation, whatever. I mean, you don't really want to have a mind that's kind of looking to having things better and what have you. These two are something we can work on right now. Look at how much our minds are caught up in this whole kind of pattern of desire. We have so many sense objects around us, and we just love to be involved in all of those, to even get more of them and to find new ones to experience and what have you. I think, the pandemic might be, a challenge to that right now, but if we think about our lives in general, I mean, that is often what we are doing, is getting caught up in all of that. Well, try to simplify your life to some degree right now so that when you get into retreat like that, you're not having all of that mind of desire, craving things you don't have, being, not okay with what you do have. We need to have a mind that's a bit more even keeled and not so caught up in all of that. So this is something we can begin to work on now. We might not be able to have a perfect environment to practice meditation in, but we can certainly begin to work on our own minds to have a bit more satisfaction. Contentment. The fourth one, maintaining pure morality. They say that morality is the basis of concentration. You might recall this from Module 9 of Discovering Buddhism. There are what are called the three higher trainings. The first training is morality. On the basis of good morality, we then learn concentration, which is what this class is about. Then, on the basis of good concentration, you can have the higher training of wisdom, which is what we're going to go into the remainder of this course. So if you have a mind that is constantly plagued even by thoughts that are not good morality, like thoughts of harming others or covetousness, what have you, well, then we're not going to be able to settle the mind so easily. Certainly, if you've engaged in a lot of harmful activities prior to, or during this life and are continuing to do that, it's not going to allow the mind to calm so easily, because those sorts of things disturb the mind. It creates unhealthy patterns that karmically become obstacles for us. So this is why right from the beginning we're emphasized to maintain pure morality. Once more, for all of us prior to retreat, you can do that right now, right? Most of you have taken the 5 vows or some portion of them, those basic vows that are about not killing, not stealing, not engaging in adultery and other um, unhealthy forms of sexual activity. And then the fourth one is the only one that's verbal, and that's not lying. And then the fifth one, not having alcohol or intoxicants. We can practice those now, even if you haven't taken the vows, and try to at least put the lid on that type of immoral behavior, unethical behavior. But then, of course, many of us have taken bodhisattva vows, even tantric vows. So it's good to be attentive to what vows you've taken and also what general discipline you want to maintain in your life. Here, I'd refer you back to like module 6 of Discovering Buddhism, where we talked about the 10 non-virtues and so on, and doing our best to refrain from those activities. So just know that, again, maintaining good morality is an important part of our path, but it's very important for developing concentration, because without that basis, it's very hard for the mind to be stilled and focused. Then the fifth is completely giving up the demands of society. Again, I alluded to that a little bit earlier about commotions and noise. This is just reiterating that we do have to kind of let go of all of that, you know, um, having so many activities in our lives, having all these things that distract us. Now, again, if you are in retreat and you leave instruction with the people at the center where you're at or whatever, that there might be some things where they would definitely come to let you know, like if you had a relative who was sick or dying or whatever the case might be. Those sorts of things, people wouldn't be wanting to not know those things and be able to do what they can. But nonetheless, the everyday demands of society, we really don't want to be impinging on our time. Then the sixth one, completely abandoning thoughts of desire. This again sounds very similar to the other two, but this is specifically around sense objects. The mind being caught up in all of these desire for the objects of taste, objects of smell, objects of our visual consciousness, auditory consciousness, what have you. So again, this will make it very hard for us to calm the mind if we're completely caught up in all of that. That's kind of like Venerable Rabina's thing of saying we're like junkies born into a world of junk. If this is how we live our lives, as we're continually being driven from one object to the next, well then when we get into retreat, it's going to be very hard, because we're going to be so caught up in sense objects. So again, some of these are fairly similar, but as I said, some of these are also something we can practice now, especially the last 5. Giving up demands of society. Well, again, all of us have to be involved in society to some degree, but it doesn't mean that we have to be overly involved in it, to kind of get caught up in it to where we feel we can never extract ourselves from it. The tendrils get in and we just kind of sucks us into all of that. So these are the kind of essential conditions. And as I said, if you are able to, certainly practice every day with some form of this type of meditation that leads to calm abiding. But recognize it, in spite of what Venerable Renee says, which again I think is it's reassuring to know that, yeah, it's possible maybe for some of us to develop this mind in our homes on our own without going into retreat. But I would say probably the much easier way is to be able to find a place that meets those conditions, that actually becomes a place where you can deepen your concentration to that degree. Pabanka Rinpoche, most of you have been reading Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, and I don't remember the page number, but in here he says, if you have all these conditions in place, you will be able to attain calm abiding within 6 months. Some people more much earlier, simply because they've trained their mind well enough going into retreat that they don't have as many obstacles. But even for somebody who maybe has a number of obstacles, they'll get through some of those obstacles within the first month or so, even less than that. And they will be able, in the course of 5 months additional time, be able to develop this mind of calm abiding. I mean, that doesn't sound like so much. If we look at 6 months, I mean, we could have spent the 6 months of this pandemic in retreat and developed calm abiding already. Wouldn't that have been wonderful? But nonetheless, this is something that we might aspire to, is to be able to look at, oh, how would I set up my life to be able to be away for some period of time, 5 months, 6 months, whatever. But then in the meantime, practice all the things that I was talking about. Practice diminishing our desires, simplifying our lives, doing our meditation every day, and learning about calm abiding. There are many ways other than Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, which has excellent instruction on it. There are many other books out there that will give you even more guidance, so that when you actually go into retreat, you're going to be like already, you'll be prepared to do that. Let's talk about the next topic, which is the objects of observation. So I'll put this screen up here just so we can refresh our memory. So the objects of observation for calm abiding. My teacher in Italy, Geshe Jampa Gyatso, he said that essentially anything can be an object for calm abiding. Calm abiding is about choosing an object, and this is about any of our stabilizing meditation, choosing an object that you want to remain single-pointedly focused on. So again, it's there are different factors that are all involved in this, but essentially we want to have some object that we feel some affinity towards, and that does allow the mind to be somewhat calm. So while we can say everything is potentially an object for observing, in terms of this type of meditation, there are a lot of objects that probably aren't so good. Like, you could do single-pointed meditation on anger. Some of us do that sometimes in our lives, right? Where we just get so stewed up in our angry thoughts at a particular person. Well, that's not a good meditation for developing single-pointed concentration, because it clouds the mind with that delusion of anger. So obviously, negative states of mind are not a good idea. Even objects that have a negative connotation to them. Again, not that there's anything inherently there, but for us, there are certain objects that can be very challenging. You wouldn't want to meditate on a weapon, for example, like, do single-pointed concentration on an AK-47 or something. You don't want to use something that is going to be disturbing to the mind. Even like Geshe Jampa Gyatso, when he was talking about this, he said, well, you could have calm abiding developed on a basis of a computer. But a computer, who wants to like visualize a computer in front of them and work with that? Know that, again, there are multitude of objects that we could use, but ideally there are a number that are really useful. Now, in the traditional teachings, they go into all of these various things that are objects of observation on the basis of the individual person and what have you, but I'm going to talk about them in general terms today. The most obvious object of observation for us to work with in developing this type of meditation is the breath. And Alan Wallace, who many of you have heard of, Alan Wallace has done a lot of work with calm abiding and actually developed a whole study of this, with bringing people together to do 3-month retreats together and see where people get in terms of their own development during that time. He says that for Westerners, a lot of these techniques of like visualizing that come up in Tantra, or even the other one I'm going to mention, which is one of the advice pieces of advice that's given by Pabanka Rinpoche and other masters, is to meditate on a visualized Buddha. Well, when you have to conjure up something to meditate on, I have to first visualize the Buddha in front of me, and then, have all the details there and have it like kind of perfectly holding it in my mind before I can even begin to develop concentration. That's another challenge for our minds, right? Our minds are already so distracted. It's better to not have to fabricate or formulate an object. Well, the breath is with us all the time, right? We're breathing in, we're breathing out. It's a wonderful meditation object simply because it does allow us to have that present that we don't need to conjure up. We don't need to, think about the breath in those ways. Now, having said that, recognize that most of the instructions we get around the breath are to use it as a tactile sensation, right? We're feeling the breath come into the body. We're feeling the breath go out of the body. That point at the nose that I was mentioning, or they say the point that's about 4 finger widths below your navel, where you feel the rising and falling of the abdomen. Even just the general sensation of the breathing in and the expansion of the body and the contracting of the body when you breathe out. These are all tactile sensations, right? We know of the breath through our feeling of it. You can hear the breath too at times. That's why I turn my microphone off whenever I'm leading a meditation, because I don't need all of you to hear my breathing, then get in the way of your breathing and your meditation. But, it's not usually an auditory thing. It's a tactile sensation. To develop calm abiding, we do need an inner object, a mental object. So you may wonder, well, how can you develop calm abiding then on the basis of it being a tactile sensation? Well, what happens, according to Alan Wallace, is that somewhere in this development, I think it's around the 4th mental abiding or mental state, we'll talk about those later today, it does transmute into a mental object. Your focusing on the breath actually becomes a very subtle object that appears to your inner eye, to your mind's eye, rather than to your tactile sensation or to your visual consciousness or what have you. But using any of our other sense consciousnesses to meditate on an object is not a good idea generally. It's okay if you're going to meditate on a Buddha. For example, I have this nice little, this is one that Rinpoche gave me. Sometimes he gives out these little Buddhas. You're not meditating on the statue per se, but the statue gives you a good idea of what a Buddha about this size would look like. They do say that it's good to work with smaller objects because the mind can be much more focused rather than a life-size Buddha in front of you, because then you've got like kind of all the various parts of the Buddha. It's a lot to hold in your awareness, whereas a small Buddha like this is much easier to focus on. So you can look at something like this and get an idea of what it would be like to have a Buddha this size, about the level of the eyes, directly in front of you. And you would want to hold the awareness of the Buddha being there, and of course fill in all the details and what have you. You can do that, but at some point you don't want to have a visual object involved, or like a tanka or a picture of the Buddha or anything else. You want to be able to have that in your mind's eye, to be a mental object. Now, why is that important? It's important because it's only through that we can develop this calm abiding. We don't develop calm abiding through our sense consciousnesses. It's a mental consciousness creation. It is the single pointed focus that we develop within the mental consciousness. So therefore, it has to be a conceptual object, which is again, or eventually we can use certainly a non-conceptual object in terms of later on deeper realizations. But for all of us who are developing this mind initially, we need once more that kind of mental image, that idea of something. So there are techniques taught in Tantra about developing concentration in this way, but Tantra obviously involves very intricate visualizations and what have you. As Alan Wallace was saying, that I quoted earlier, that it's very hard for Westerners in general to conjure up all of that. So the 2 objects that I would suggest you use is either, if you feel inclined to a visual object, that you can hold in your awareness, something like a Buddha that you can then visualize in the space in front of you, filling in all the details, and then hold that awareness. They say the power of doing that type of meditation to develop your calm abiding is that you then have this real affinity towards the form of a Buddha, and you can even bring that to mind on your deathbed or at other times, and it can be very helpful for you to make that connection to the Buddha. But for most of us, I think it's really quite okay and fine to work with the breath. So we would focus on the breath in a way that we find amenable to our own minds. Again, the general advice given has to do with the nose and the abdomen, but we can also do other meditations with the breath, right, of counting the breaths and so on. The meditation that I'm going to ask you to work with for the next week is actually, a meditation on the breath. It's out on the website again. It's called let me see if I can pull it up here. There. It's called the Meditation to Develop Concentration. And so there's a little introduction to it and so on. As preparation, you do a little bit of meditation on the breath. But then the body of the meditation encourages you to watch your breath without distraction. Consists of taking notice of such movement as the belly, abdomen rising and falling, or the sensation of air passing through the nasal passages. You don't need to think a lot about the breath. Don't conceptualize about what's going on. Just take note of the fact that you're breathing, and try not to let your mind wander away from just that awareness of the breath, either again at either of those points or the breath in general. So he says, be as attentive as you are capable of, like when you are carrying a full mug of coffee across the living room without spilling a drop, or whatever that it is that conjures up that idea of a very heightened sense of being attentive and aware, and so on. Again, there's a little bit more about this, and maybe I'll stop the share for now, and we can go back to that at the end of today. But this is a very powerful object for us to work with because, again, it's easy for us to meditate on the breath in general. Now, again, I'm not saying it's easy right from the get-go, but it's an object that we have with us all the time. Through the force of that, we can generally develop a pretty high level of concentration. As I said, at some point it ceases to be a tactile sensation and becomes an internal image, an internal idea that we can work with our mental consciousness rather than our tactile consciousness. So one analogy that I realized I forgot to mention in regard to these two types of meditation earlier that I think is useful for you to know is the idea of that they frequently use of, like, if you were in a dark cave and there were paintings on the wall of the cave and you wanted to see them very clearly. Well, you would need kind of two factors to be involved in that, right? One is that if you had a flame, a candle or whatever, and the candle was flickering, it wasn't steady, it wasn't stable, well, then you'd never get a really good view of it, right? Because the light would go in and out. It'd be dark, sometimes light, sometimes you wouldn't be able to get kind of the full awareness of what's going on the cave wall. That's the factor we're trying to develop in this stabilizing meditation. But the strength of the light, once we have stabilized it, once we have kept all the wind from causing it to flicker and what have you, once we have made it very stable, we want a very powerful light. That's this idea of special insight that we develop through analytical meditation. So the very powerful light together with the stable flame will allow us to see all the detail that's on the cave wall. And it's kind of a nice analogy to work with in regard to this understanding of these two types of meditation. So that's a little bit about objects of observation. Know that if you are working with a teacher, a guru, what have you, who has maybe some deeper insight into what might be an appropriate object for you, it is good to get advice from them. There are some people, believe it or not, who use emptiness as their object of observation for developing calm abiding. They have that kind of disposition. For most of us, it's such an elusive topic that it's very hard to make it a topic of observation or object of observation. But know that it's good to get some advice from somebody who you have some confidence in that can give you some guidance as to what might be an appropriate object for you. But the most common ones are what I just talked about: the breath, or if you feel a little more adventurous, a visualized Buddha. And there are instructions, again, in Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand about working with that, because sometimes they say it's best just to start with the outline of the Buddha, so you just have that outline and kind of then you fill in the details. Just like if you were making a painting, you'd first, sketch out where everything is going to be and then you fill it in. And you begin with, certain levels of detail and then you get into greater detail. And eventually you can hold the detail in its entirety in that one visualized object of the visualized Buddha in the space before you. But again, for many people, that's a little too hard. And that's perfectly fine then just to work with the breath. So let's take a little break. It's already an hour into the class. I can't believe it. When we get back, I'm going to talk about the 5 obstacles and the 8 antidotes. And then I'm going to just probably have the briefest of time to go through these stages. But the stages are not as important to know at this juncture, just to be aware that there is a sort of laid out method for developing the mind to that level of calm abiding. So let's just take 10 minutes then. At 11:40, we'll reconvene and I'll ring the bell on my end just in case you wander away so you can hear the bell and know that class is starting again. All right, I'll see you shortly. But it's a really excellent one, The Attention Revolution by Alan Wallace. B. Alan Wallace is technically his name, but This book it goes through the stages that I'm going to be covering a little bit later in brief. And so if you're interested in that topic, you might actually find some more information here that's quite useful. And on page 64, when he's talking about this fourth stage, which again, we'll talk about the 9 stages shortly, he says, in the phases of mindfulness of breathing thus far, you have been attending in various ways to the tactile sensations of the respiration of your breathing. However, to continue all the way along the path of shamatha, eventually you must shift your attention from the tactile sensations of breathing to what he calls here an acquired sign, a symbol of the air element that appears before the mind's eye as you progress in shamatha practice. To different people, acquired signs associated with the breath practice may appear like a star, a cluster of gems or pearls, a wreath of flowers, a puff of smoke, a cobweb, a cloud, a lotus flower, a wheel, or the moon or sun. The various appearances of the acquired sign are related to the mental dispositions of individual meditators. If you wish to continue on the path of mindfulness of breathing, which here explicitly turns into the mindfulness with breathing, as soon as such a sign arises, shift your attention to this sign. This will be your object of attention as you proceed along the rest of the 9 stages leading to shamatha, to calm abiding. So it's just really quite interesting. I'd never seen that spelled out so clearly in any other text. So he says it again, if you decide that you'd like to work with the breath because it is such a simple object, and it's 2 pages later where he actually talks about the complications he sees around a visualized object, like a visualized image of the Buddha. He says here, many of us, both Asians and Westerners, have found that the effort required to generate and sustain such an image is exhausting. If one practices concentrating on a deliberately visualized image for short periods, there may be no perceptible strain. But if this is done for many hours each day, for day after day, week after week, this can drain your energy and lead to excessive stress and tension. So again, that's his experience. It's not to say, again, that everyone's going to have the same experience, but know that the breath is encouraged often as an object of meditation, that there is this shift from it being a tactile sensation to being a mental image, an acquired sign that will occur naturally. And when that happens, at that stage, you would move to that. But again, that's maybe further down the road. We'll get into those stages. So far we've talked about, again, this idea of these 2 different types of meditations, all the favorable conditions that we need to have in place in order to develop this state of mind of calm abiding, and then also looked at what objects we might observe for that. Let's look at the next topic, which is essentially the faults that we have, obstacles that are inhibiting our calm abiding, and the antidotes to them. So here we're not talking about external things, we're talking about the faults or the obstacles within our own mind. So there is a wonderful little chart for that as well that is in the um, handout that I had up here earlier. Let me go ahead and get that back up here. Oh, one thing I might say before we get into that is know that I will put this out on the website as well. This handout, I usually give this out back in Module 2 when we talk about meditation. But know that there are instructions that are given about the 7-point meditation posture. And I'm not going to go into those about where you have your legs, arms, back, eyes, the jaw and mouth, the tongue, the head. Anyway, know that I'll put that out there. If you're not familiar with those, you can refer to that. I'll send that along to Mary Mogenberg, and she'll make sure it gets posted at the Dropbox location for this course. So again, know that that is an important part of it, is before we actually sit down into meditation, that we try to have as correct a meditation posture as possible, recognizing that every one of us has different bodies and different limitations on our bodies. So know that, again, it's not going to look identical for every one of us, but as best as we can, try to have our bodies in the 7-point posture. The 5 obstacles. Let's start with the very first one, laziness. Laziness in the Buddhist teachings is generally referring to something that keeps us from actually getting on the cushion. But there can be different forms of laziness. The first one that's most evident is that laziness of mañana mentality that we have in New Mexico, right? Of the sort of putting things off, procrastination, not doing things, right away. But there's also a laziness, which I call the laziness of busyness, which is all of our attachment and attraction towards more mundane things. We fill our lives with all this stuff, and we just love to, have our schedule all booked out, and then we go, oh, I don't have time for my meditation. Why? Because you're doing all these other things, and you're quite attached attached to all those other things. This is why you have to structure your life for meditation and not let your life dictate when and where you can meditate. The third type of laziness is what I was mentioning earlier, laziness of despondency, thinking I can't possibly do that. The Buddha says that's actually laziness. Why? Because as I mentioned earlier, you can accomplish this. All the every practitioner who's ended up becoming a Buddha started just like us with crazy minds and busy lives and whatever, and had to make a determination that they were going to actually engage in this. And if we put our minds to it, we can accomplish it. So just know that there are different types of laziness, but it's anything that keeps you from getting on the cushion, from doing the work. Or cushion, I say cushion, but again, you can meditate in a chair. Sometimes people have difficulty sitting on a meditation cushion. Even different types of things like the what do they call it? The kind of things that raise you up. I can't remember the names of those. Those like Zen seats that they have that are kind of raised up so you can put your feet underneath or whatever. Know that you don't have to be sitting on the floor to attain calm abiding, but some people find it useful. If you're sitting in a chair, whatever. Again, the whole point here is that we have this something that keeps us from getting there. Something that kind of is our first obstacle that we have to encounter. Our laziness, our inability to actually dedicate time to doing this. So let's take a look at the 4 antidotes to that, because I think it's useful if we actually go through these and talk about the antidotes as we talk about each of the various obstacles. The antidotes are said to be, first of all, and these are a hierarchy. First of all, we have to have some faith. Faith in Buddhism is not blind faith. It is actually a conviction that we have in our ability to attain concentration, as well as all the instructions that have been given to us. Part of what I'm going through today, again, a lot of it you may have to look at after this class, because I won't have time to go into everything pertaining to developing calm abiding. But know that we have to develop that confidence ourselves through having been with teachers teaching this to us who have attained that, which I haven't, again, but other teachers who have attained deep levels of concentration. We begin to generate some conviction that we can attain that. Then, of course, where did faith, if that's all it was, oh, I'm convinced I can do this. Well, we have to aspire to do it. In the context of this, aspiration is referring to our aspiration, our desire to engage in the practices that will lead us to having concentration, which means that we aspire to use our time, some portion of every day, to do our dedicated sitting practice, what have you. And then throughout each session, we also are doing that so that we don't have a laziness that gets distracted to other affairs and what have you. We have that aspiration that moves us in that direction. And of course, that aspiration isn't enough unless we actually make effort. By effort, we mean the ability for us to dedicate our energies towards achieving something. In this case, calm abiding. So faith, aspiration, and effort are the 3 things that get you away from that laziness that keeps you from doing the work. If we have that strong foundation of faith, we aspire to achieve it, and then we engage in actual practices with dedicated effort, with great enthusiasm and perseverance, there's no doubt that we will get there. Now, the 4th one is an interesting one. We can begin to have some level of the word here, pliancy. It's essentially a serviceability of our bodies and our minds that comes in its fullest form when we get to the end of the road, when we actually attain calm abiding. But we can begin to see that our minds and our bodies become more serviceable throughout our development of our meditative ability. When you get to that point, and I'll talk about that later today, when you actually arrive at calm abiding, there is a special notable level of pliancy, surfaceability, even sometimes it's called suppleness, that occurs with regard to both our minds and our bodies. That is a demarcation that we have actually attained that result. That is way further down the road, but know that, again, there are some indications that the mind is becoming more serviceable. Our bodies are becoming more used to meditation, what have you. The second fault that we often have in our meditation right from the beginning is what's called forgetting the instruction. The instruction is to stay present with the object that you are observing. If it's the breath, then it's like I say every time when I lead a meditation on that, observe the breath. Try to stay with it, stay present with it. And if the mind wanders, then to correct it. Again, but the main instruction is to stay with the breath, to stay on the object that you are using as the focal point for your meditation. The antidote, if you're forgetting the instruction, if you're kind of off thinking about all sorts of other things, is to restore your mindfulness. Mindfulness, of course, is a big buzzword in Buddhism, right? Mindfulness has different connotations in different traditions. In this tradition, how we are referring to mindfulness is that non-forgetfulness with regard to an object. So when we have mindfulness, we are mindful of the breath. We are with the breath. We are aware of the sensation of the breath at the nose or the abdomen, whatever it is that we're focusing on, and we are maintaining that awareness. That mindfulness is together there with our concentration, with our focus on that object. If we forget the breath and we move elsewhere, whatever else has distracted us, the antidote is to restore your mindfulness of the breath. Of course, we have to become aware of that. That's the next step in these faults and antidotes. But the simple moving away from the breath, forgetting that object, forgetting the instruction, means that the antidote is to become more mindful, to restore our mindfulness of it. Very simple in regard to how this actually plays out, but it's hard, obviously, to do. The third problem that we often have is that we don't identify these two factors. Now, again, I'll talk about these in their very technical way, but know that they are correlated to the two main things that cause us not to have good concentration even right now, which is essentially sometimes the mind is wandering outward, which is all of our distraction, that mind that is wandering and getting involved in all sorts of things that seem much more tantalizing and interesting than meditating on the breath. Or sometimes because we are withdrawing the mind to some degree from our external world when we meditate, the mind sort of collapses in on itself. So let's talk a little bit about these two factors that are more specific moments within that whole general category. I mean, for most of us, again, when I give basic meditation instruction, I'm always talking about those two ways. Sometimes the mind is like out. I mean, it's not really literally out there, but it's like getting distracted to things that we're recalling from our past or that we are thinking about in our present, something that's in the fridge that we want to eat or whatever. There's all these things that are kind of keeping the mind sort of out there and not allowing it to rest on the object. But then, as I said, sometimes when we're with the object, the mind collapses in on itself and becomes very heavy and dull, where we have that sort of darkness to the mind, that dullness to the mind. All of that can be summarized in that kind of concept. But laxity, which is a more specific moment of that, is referring to a very specific state of mind that can be manifesting, especially when we have developed some deeper concentration already. We've begun our progress in that direction. Excitement is connected to the mind that is wandering out, but it's a very specific form of mental distraction, of mental wandering. So let's talk about these two. And I want to introduce here kind of the concept that each of these also has a coarser level and a subtler level. And certainly when we even get into the general category, for example, of that dullness of the mind, the coarser level is when the mind gets really sleepy, right? You're sitting on your cushion and your head starts nodding, and you kind of keep, trying to keep yourself awake. That's a very coarse form of this dullness to the mind. But other times we might feel like we're meditating, but the mind's still really not too sharp, not too clear. It's very foggy. Again, those are still in the realm of these, even though you might say one's coarse and subtle in relation to each other, they're still much coarser compared to laxity. What is laxity? Laxity is a factor that makes the mind lack either clarity or intensity. So when we are, again, a bit further along the road in our meditation, when we lack that clarity, that is said to be a coarser form of laxity, where the mind is on the object to some degree, but it's not so clear. It's not so vibrant in our minds. If it's a visual object, it's not appearing in that way, even if it's the breath or whatever. And again, the breath becoming that mental object, that acquired sign, as Alan Wallace said, it's not having that heightened kind of clarity. When we overcome the grosser form of laxity, there's still a subtle laxity which doesn't allow it to be intense. I know these words start sounding a little vague, and they're still vague in my mind because I'm not developed to that degree. But clarity and intensity are kind of these two factors that we need to have that are a part of the um, uh, main factor that we're trying to develop, which is the calmness of the mind to not be so distracted and to abide on its object, for some continuity of time. You know, a lot of people, when they meditate, they go, oh, it's so relaxing, but they're not really doing maybe this deeper meditation where we're trying to make the mind really focused. If the mind's going to be focused, it needs to have those factors of clarity and intensity. So I'm just going to talk about these again in such brief ways because we don't have so much time, but know that laxity will appear as a fault a little bit further along the road when we've gotten rid of the coarser forms of this dullness and foggy-mindedness, when we think we're with the object, but there's going to be this lack of a clarity to it, that not appearing so clearly to the mind. And there's also, even when we overcome that, a lack of intensity. That's about all I can say about them, again, because I don't have any personal experience beyond that. Excitement, on the other hand, is a bit coarser and in and of itself, because it is much more easy to notice when that is in our minds. And it will be happening right from the beginning. Excitement is that distracted, wandering mind, but specifically towards objects of attachment. So whereas we can have a lot of things distracting our minds, right? You can sit down to meditate and maybe you just had an argument with a relative or something, and then that's going through your mind, all your thoughts of anger at them. Well, that's not excitement in this context. Excitement is specifically referring to when we have a mind that is attracted to objects of attachment. Again, it can appear in coarser forms and subtler forms. The coarser forms are the ones that are evident to us right from the beginning, when the mind gets caught up in going towards those sense objects, thinking about all those pleasant things, sometimes pleasant things of the past, pleasant things of the present, generally pleasant things that we want to experience in the present that seem, again, so much more enticing than focusing on the breath or meditating, on that object that we've chosen. So again, this is the coarser form. But once we remove the coarser form, there can still be subtle excitement, which is the tendency of the mind to still have some of that drive, even though we might be holding on to the object to some degree. They say this is like water underneath ice. If you've seen rivers that have frozen on the top of them, the water's still flowing underneath them. So it might seem like we're really firm, like we're not moving, but there's a subtle movement of the mind towards these attractive objects. So again, I'm just giving you an idea of what these are. They become more evident, they say, as you develop on these stages of proceeding towards calm abiding, especially laxity. Laxity is very hard for us to get at right now because we're dealing with such coarser forms of it. Most people, when they sit down to meditate, are going to see and notice there's one of these two things happening. Maybe not again at the subtler level, but definitely at the coarser level. The mind's getting distracted and wandering out. Sometimes it's excitement. Sometimes it's just, getting caught up in various things that are going on in our lives, preoccupations, worries, what have you. And then we're going to also have the mind getting very heavy and dull. Those are things that you overcome within the first few stages. The subtler forms that are, again, laxity and excitement become a little bit more obvious the further along that you go. Okay, so let's go back to the chart and see that again, what we were talking about in terms of these obstacles in this presentation is the non-identification of laxity and excitement. What happens again, especially with the subtler forms of these, is that when you are meditating on the object, you think you're doing just fine, but you may have some of that lack of clarity or lack of intensity that are the coarse and subtle forms of laxity. You may even have some of the subtle excitement going on, which is that water flowing under ice that's keeping the mind moving towards objects of pleasure, objects of attachment. The non-identification of those means that we haven't noticed that they are happening. Again, this is going to be a little bit further along in our meditative progress. What do we need at that time? Of course, this factor that's on the right-hand side of these 8 antidotes, this is something we need all the time. It's a factor we call introspection. Sometimes other names are given to this, like vigilance or guarding alertness. The idea is, again, and this is something I introduce people to right from the beginning in meditative instruction, is you have the object that you're meditating on, and then I say, try to keep your awareness with that. That's maintain your mindfulness. But if the mind wanders, when you notice that, this is the noticing mind, we call it like a spy in the corner of the mind. This is your introspection. It notices that you've wandered away from the breath. It notices that the mind has gotten really heavy and that you're getting sleepy. It's a factor that we need to have to kind of check in occasionally. But it's not good to have it there all the time. Maybe at the beginning we need to have it coming in frequently. I often compared this to like a security guard, that makes the rounds. And so the security guard doesn't need to be stationed everywhere all the time, right? It's good enough to just kind of go around and then to eventually come back to where, you started and see what's going on there. So we don't, I'm not saying that that part of our mind should be wandering. I'm just saying that we don't need to be present all the time with this factor of introspection because it becomes an obstacle in and of itself. But we do need to have the ability to see what the quality of our meditation is. So that's why I encourage people, again, right from the beginning, to heighten that sense of some aspect of our mind that does check in occasionally, like a parent checking up to see how their kid is doing on their homework or something, to see, oh, are you really paying attention? Are you really doing it, what you're doing? But if the parent was hovering all the time, the kid would get annoyed, right? So it's the same thing. We don't need this introspection there all the time, but we need occasionally to check in because we may not have identified the faults in the mind, either at the grosser level that most of us are starting with, or the subtler level of laxity and the subtle excitement that can be obstacles to really deepening our concentration. Okay, so that's an obstacle that, again, we can begin to work on to some degree, but not to the degree that these subtler forms are happening, because that won't happen initially. That's going to happen further down the road. The fourth of our faults is when we're not applying an antidote. It says non-application, but it's shorthand for not applying an antidote. So say we do identify laxity and excitement, but we don't do anything about it. We don't actually correct those. Of course, anything that's involved with a dullness of the mind, we want to raise the mind. So even with laxity, we sort of want to raise it, kind of more focus the mind greater, make it more intense, clearer. With excitement, we want to bring the mind down. That's the sort of antidotes that we apply. Again, I'm not going to go into all of what's in the antidote there of application. Applying an antidote generally means to fine-tune the mind. This whole process of meditation is like a balancing act. Many of you will recall in the film Little Buddha when there's two men that are floating down the river and the Buddha overhears them because he's been doing his meditation of making the mind really kind of very tight or what have you through his ascetic practices. And then prior to that, of course, he was in the palace as Prince Siddhartha with all this self-mortification or self-indulgence. So self-mortification and self-indulgence, neither extreme works. You have to find a balance between those. It's the same with our meditation. And of course, these guys playing the stringed instrument, whatever it was that they had done, as they were floating down the river, the one's telling the other one that, you have to have the string just right. If the string is too loose, you can't play. But if it's too tight, it breaks. And so it's the same with our meditation. What we're trying to do in applying antidotes here to what's going on in the mind is if the mind's really kind of excited and sort of caught up in all of that, well, then we want to loosen that a bit and bring the mind down. But if the mind's too loose, where it just becomes, like soup, well, then, we have to raise that. We have to tighten it up a bit. So we have these two factors of kind of like trying to find, this middle way, this balance between these. And that's, of course, what the Buddha found in his own meditation, as well as in his own view of things. This is why we often talk about even our morality being a middle way, that we're not going so far as to be like the Jains and being hyper concerned about every harm that could happen based on our breathing or our touching our bodies or whatever. But we don't want to go so lax as to where we're just neglecting how we are in the world. This middle way approach is a very appropriate one for almost everything the Buddha taught. It's the same with regard to concentration. We have to find that balance between the mind being, too excited and kind of caught up in all of this, and then too heavy and dull, and find that place in the middle where it works just right, where we have not so much tightness to the mind, but not so much looseness. Does that make some sense? And people know that already, I think, from your own meditation. Nonetheless, we all deal with, obstacles wherever we're at in terms of our own individual predispositions. But this fourth fault is where we don't apply the antidotes. We're not actually applying what needs to be done at those times. Again, recall that in basic meditation instruction, they give you things like if the mind gets too dull, well, then turn up the lights, maybe even open windows so there's more fresh air, maybe splash water on your face so that you wake yourself up a bit. If the mind's too excited, then you want to, maybe bring the light down a bit, count the breaths, bring something that, will help the mind settle a little bit more, maybe even take a break, go for a walk or something, and then come back when the mind's a bit stiller. But again, those sorts of antidotes I'm not going to talk about as much because I've gone through them previously in meditation classes and what have you. Know that we won't get to the fifth fault until way down the road. And this is where we are over applying. We are applying antidotes when we don't need to. The faults aren't there, and yet we keep applying antidotes. That would be a hindrance to our continuing on to develop deeper concentration. At those times, the antidote is what we call the mind of equanimity, which isn't this meditation on an equal regard for all beings. Equanimity here is the mind at this balanced state of not needing to do anything. Equanimity, again, we can begin to get a taste for that sometimes if we feel like, yeah, the mind's getting too distracted, we're bringing it down. The mind's getting too heavy, we're bringing it up. And we kind of rest in that middle way, that middle space. But know that for most of us, we're going to keep having obstacles that arise, and so we still need to be very attentive. This is for somebody who's way further down the road, who doesn't need to apply any of these antidotes because they've made the mind very much in what we call equipoise. The mind doesn't have all that going on. These faults have been removed through one's meditation, but they keep applying antidotes as if the faults were there. So again, that's way further down the line for most of us. So again, those are what are traditionally set out. And I think, again, there's some value, regardless of whether we're further down the line or not, about knowing what are the main things that we're going to be encountering. Right from the beginning, laziness, not getting our butt on the cushion or doing the meditation that we need to do. So we need those antidotes at that time. Not being with the object, forgetting that instruction. We need to make sure that we maintain mindfulness, and maintain mindfulness not just on the cushion, but off the cushion. To have a mindfulness of where we are, what we're doing. That sort of presence with things is really important, so that when we get back on the cushion, we don't have to restart things again. And if you're in retreat, that's an important part. The space between sessions is as important in many ways as this time actually on the cushion. So, and then the next faults of not identifying laxity and excitement, or even in our case, the grosser forms of those distracted minds or dull minds, and not, seeing that they're going on, so that we then are aware of what we need to do. And of course, the fourth fault, if we don't apply antidotes at that time, if we just let those just hang out in that space of a dull mind, well, we're going to get ourselves in trouble. We're not going to have very sharp meditative focus if we just chill out in these, dull states, sleepy states with a foggy mind. That's not what meditation's about at all. Okay, and then the last one again was that over application, which is way down the road. So let me go through very briefly. I realize I've been saying a lot, and you probably even have some questions. Don't be afraid to put the questions in the chat box if you have time to do that. I know because I'm going, that it's very hard to, kind of get distracted to other things. But what I want to do is go through what has been set out in this wonderful instruction as to what the stages of developing the mind are. The 9 mental stages, or mental abidings are sometimes called, and the other factors that play a role. I won't have time to go through maybe what are to the left and the right. The middle column is where I want to focus, and where I can, I'll bring in information from the left and the right. But know that, again, you can read Pabanka Rinpoche's text, and he goes into much more detail. The pages for that are in the assignment for last week. Recall that, again, I generally try to assign the readings for you to do in advance. And I'm going to use His Holiness's book, because recall that there was one wonderful little chapter about meditation, well, a section, a part of it had like 2 or 3 chapters within it. Part 3, Harnessing the Power of Concentration and Insight. And so on page 112, he begins and talks about these various levels of the mind. How we train our minds. They go from bottom to top. That's why I've got them numbered. At the bottom is number 1, all the way up to the top, which is just prior to attaining calm abiding. So number 1 is where most of us might still be at. Certainly where you start. It's simply called placing the mind. Or, as His Holiness in the book that he did with Jeffrey Hopkins that I'm reading from, he says, he calls this putting the mind on the object. So here His Holiness says, when after hearing or reading instructions on how to set the mind on an object of meditation, like you've gotten today or previously, in terms of your meditation instruction, you initially draw the mind inside and try to put it there, put it on that object, the breath or the Buddha image, whatever. And you will be subject to a waterfall of thoughts, one after another. If so, you are on the first level. You may even have so many thoughts that it seems as if trying to meditate makes them increase. But you are simply noticing the previously unidentified extent of your own ramblings or ruminations or whatever you want to call them. Your attempts at mindfulness are causing you to notice what is happening. So this is where we all start. And of course, the power that is involved in this is hearing the advice in advance so that causes us to actually say, I need to start doing this practice. So we put our mind on the breath, but the mind is not going to be on the breath most of the time. It's going to be caught up in all those distractions. And it's only going to be small portions of our meditation period where we're actually on the breath. This is a forced engagement, and even the next stage is a forced engagement, meaning that we have to force the mind to engage in the object. The second one, placement with continuity, or what His Holiness called periodic placement, he describes this as you energetically employ mindfulness and ask yourself again and again, am I staying on the object? That's that factor of introspection. You become able to put your mind on the object for brief periods, though there is still more distraction than there is attention to the object. This is the second level, during which rambling thought sometimes takes a rest and sometimes suddenly arises, right? Go back and forth between those. The main problems during the first two levels come from laziness and forgetting the object, but laxity and excitement also prevent a steady continuum of meditative attention. And again, in their grosser forms are certainly, or that grosser form of dullness and grosser form of distraction are certainly going to be playing a role in keeping us from having a continuity of meditation. Then His Holiness says, during the first two levels, you are working at getting your mind on the object. Later, you'll be working on keeping it there. So that's why, again, it's called forced engagement, because you have to get the mind on the object, engage in the object. Let's go to number 3. His Holiness calls this withdrawal and resetting, but the more normal term for this is patch-like placement, meaning that it's like there's places where you are kind of with it, but then you sort of have to patch up the gaps in between. So this is how he describes it. It's very brief. He says, as you gradually come to recognize distraction sooner and sooner through more mindfulness, you become able to place your attention back on the object when it has wandered, as if putting a patch on a cloth, kind of patching up those gaps where you've wandered away from the object. Mindfulness has now matured to the point where you immediately recognize distraction. So this is why that's the power for this one and the next stage, the fourth one, is because your mindfulness needs to become much more heightened for you to be able to know what's going on and patch up the mind when it starts to wander through excitement or whatever other distractions, or when it becomes dull, that you know what to do at that point. You're mindful enough and your introspection is strong enough for you to be able to be aware of that and actually maintain a bit more continuity on the object. The fourth, the close placement, or what His Holiness called staying close, this is already a pretty amazing level of development. I'll read what is entailed in this and we'll talk about it a little bit. He says, when, due to the full maturation of mindfulness, you are able immediately to counter laziness and forgetfulness, you pass to the fourth level, in which you do not lose the object in forgetfulness. So that kind of second fault of forgetting the object is no longer present. Coarse excitement is over, but subtle versions persist, interfering from time to time, though not causing you to lose the object. On the first three levels, laziness and forgetfulness were the main problems, but now laxity and excitement have become the chief concerns because, as I said, with subtle excitement in particular, you're staying with the object, but there is this water under the ice that is causing you to have some movement towards objects of attachment. And then laxity is a much subtler mind where, again, you have the object, but as I said, in coarser laxity, you don't have the clarity. In subtle laxity, you don't have the intensity. So once we get to close placement, we are already with the object, with the ability to stay present with it, not always with the same level of intensity or clarity, power, but nonetheless, we have mastered, that ability to remain with the object. One thing I might mention, as a little break here at this point, looking at this fourth level, I think this was the level Venerable Rabina says she had a conversation with Venerable Rene, this monk who I mentioned who's done these longer retreats, who's a pretty incredible practitioner. He said, from his own experience, I'm assuming, that when you get to this fourth level, that you're already experiencing an unbelievable sort of bliss in your mind that you've never known before in our everyday lives. We think we get so much enjoyment out of, the things that we partake of in our senses, all those sorts of pleasurable feelings. We don't know what is untapped within us that we can experience just by calming the mind in this way. Being able to just stay present with an object with that greater continuity is already pretty amazing, they say. Again, Venerable Rene says. Again, don't know it from personal experience yet, haven't had that opportunity, but it's inspiring to hear those kinds of things, right? Because this is what often keeps us from getting on the cushion, right? It's just, we'd rather chill out with all those things that seem more pleasant, more enjoyable. If we put our time into the cushion, though, you can get to a place where you're experiencing even greater joy and contentment than what you've known in your everyday life. So let's go back to the chart then. We're still in this sort of section that has to do with what's called uninterrupted engagement. I'm sorry. Yeah, uninterrupted engagement, which actually is pointing to the fact that we will have, whoops, I'm going to pull up the right thing here. Let me do the share. Oops, there it is. Okay. All right, sorry, my little technical thing here. Okay, so we get back to this, and we will still have, again, some interruption to our engagement in the next few stages, but obviously we'll be on the object with some continuity, with a greater continuity than what occurred prior to this. The next stage that we enter into is the fifth, called controlling here, or in His Holiness's book, Disciplining the Mind. He says, introspection now becomes stronger, and through your own experience, you recognize the advantages of meditative stability. Coarse laxity no longer arises. In other words, you've got that sort of ability to be clearly with the object. You don't have necessarily the intensity all the time, but at least it is clearly appearing. The withdrawal of the mind from extraneous objects, he says, now proceeds too far, so it becomes necessary to apply remedies to subtle laxity and thereby heighten the mind. So again, he's just pointing to the fine-tuning that occurs at this level, where we're controlling the mind. These subtler forms of things start to appear and become more evident, and we need to do what we can to heighten that intensity, maintain that clarity, not allow the mind to have any of these sort of subtler forms of these faults. Level 6, pacifying the mind. By applying remedies to subtle laxity, he says, you attain the 6th level. Introspection has fully developed. Of course, we had that as the factor, the power to the left here for both the 5th and the 6th, because we need that heightened introspection at that time to see these subtler faults. But it says here, introspection has fully developed, and through your own experience, you know the faults of scattering to thoughts and destructive emotions. Subtle laxity poses no great danger. However, those very remedies for overcoming subtle laxity by heightening the mind may lead to an overly invigorated mind. And now there is a danger of generating subtle excitement. So subtle excitement does seem to manifest here to some degree when we have that heightened awareness in the mind by applying antidotes and what have you. So again, these are just the fine-tuning in this section of 5th and 6th levels, where we are able through our introspection to remove those subtler forms of laxity and excitement. Now we get on to the 7th level, which there is called thorough pacifying or thoroughly pacifying the mind. Here His Holiness says, this is page 115, he says, by applying remedies to subtle excitement, you reach the 7th level. As soon as desire, scattering, laxity, lethargy, and the like are produced in even subtle form, you abandon them through just a bit of exertion, just some effort you put out there and they go away. Now you no longer need to be concerned about coming under the influence of subtle laxity and excitement. Effort is now able to stop laxity and excitement so that they cannot damage your concentration, even if they make slight interruptions. So there's going to be, again, some slight interruptions happening, but they're not going to be anything that really challenges the mind, because the mind is able to very quickly, through effort, very minimal effort generally, do away with those, extinguish those. So wow, this is amazing. We've gotten to a place where our effort is the power that we're using, but that's because we no longer need to rely upon the other ones. We just have a little bit of effort that is necessary to calm the mind and remove those subtle forms of these distractions. Level 8, making one pointed, or making the mind one pointed, is what His Holiness said. Similar idea. Now the power of effort has fully matured, so that with just a little exertion at the beginning of the session, the entire session of meditation remains devoid of laxity and excitement, and you are able to maintain meditative stability without interruption. That's why it's now uninterrupted engagement. Before, you were still having small interruptions that were keeping you from being completely there. Now you're one-pointed. Nothing else is going to interrupt, because subtle laxity and subtle excitement are gone. You don't need any of that. You have a little bit of effort to get you into that place, and then no other effort really needed, because the mind's already in that space of being single-pointed. His Holiness goes on to say, analyzing whether laxity or excitement are about to arise is no longer needed during the session. Now such exertion can be set aside, but this does not mean loosening the intensely clear mode of perceiving the object. Rather, you stay with that, and the object appears very clearly, intensely, and you continue to abide on that till you get to the 9th stage, which is through the force of your familiarity, through that power, you are able to place the mind with this equanimity, or the mind placed in equipoise, the term that's more technical that His Holiness uses. This is called spontaneous engagement, because you don't even really need much exertion at all. You just go immediately into that place of abiding single-pointedly on the object. Here he says, now that you have, this is page 116, now that you have gained the power of familiarity from this training, the exertion of implementing mindfulness and introspection is no longer needed, and the mind places itself on the object of its own accord. The 9th level is spontaneous. When at the start of a session you set your mind on the object, meditative stability is sustained without interruption for a long time through its own force, without needing to rely even on the slight initial exertion required on the previous level. You now have no need to apply remedies to any type of laxity or excitement. Okay, so you may think, wow, I'm there then. This sounds pretty wild. The mind's able to just turn towards the object. That's the minimal amount of exertion that would be needed, nothing more. And you're immediately one-pointedly on it, and you just continue to abide on it for as long as you wish without any distraction. You might think, okay, that sounds like a pretty good place to be. Well, you're not to calm abiding yet. I hate to say it, but there's still another phase to go through. Here I want to turn to liberation in the palm of your hand, because he describes it really nicely. This was part of the reading assignment for this class today, was if you had, Pabanka Rinpoche's text and wanted to do that reading. This is on page 617, is where he talks about the way true mental quiescence or calm abiding develops from this point, from having reached this 9th level. All right. So he says, when you reach the 9th state, your single-pointed concentration is free of subtle dullness and excitement, or laxity and excitement. You are able to remain in this state effortlessly for long periods. And yet this state is not true mental quiescence. It's not calm abiding yet. It only resembles it. In order to achieve true mental quiescence, you must meditate single-pointedly again and again to gain further familiarity with it. You must then attain the exceptional bliss that comes with mental and physical suppleness. Remember how I mentioned pliancy is that final antidote to laziness? There are 4 antidotes to laziness: faith, aspiration, effort, and pliancy, or suppleness. That is where you get to the final antidote, to where there's nothing that will ever keep you from getting on your cushion again, because you are essentially totally involved in meditation and in the ability that you have, having attained calm abiding. And that's because you gain a serviceability of your mind and body that no longer is a problem then. You don't have any obstacles to doing further meditation. So this is how it happens. That's kind of an interesting description. He says, mental suppleness is the first of the two types to develop. First, the mind becomes incredibly serviceable. There's like a freedom in the mind, an ability to use the mind that is not having attained that prior to this. So he says, however, the bliss due to physical suppleness is actually the first of the two blisses to develop. It might sound contradictory because if the mental suppleness develops first, but yet the bliss arises from the physical, you might think, well, that's contradictory. Well, let's look at, again, how this all unfolds. He says, first of all, the deleterious energy winds within the body are pacified. Those winds that are obstacles to this are pacified, and you feel comfortable. Although you do feel a kind of pressure in the scalp or the brain. They say you feel like somebody's pressing on the top of your head, rather like the sensation of a warm hand touching your newly shaven head. Of course, he was teaching to monks. Remember, that was the audience that was hearing this. But he says, you immediately pacify the deleterious states of mind that stand in the way of carrying out any of the virtue you may wish to perform. You have now developed mental suppleness. You then develop physical suppleness as a result of this mental suppleness, and the energy winds are now well adapted and circulating throughout the body. Again, in Buddhist physiology, they say there is the subtler physiology that's going on in terms of the winds, and the winds are all together with our minds. And so when we have that sort of physical suppleness, we feel it then even physically in terms of the freedom of those winds to circulate. So it says, now the body is free of any deleterious states and feels no discomfort while you perform virtuous practices. It can be put to any use you want. The bottle is supple and light as cotton. You thus experience great bliss from this physical suppleness, and the body has extremely blissful natural physical sensations. So you develop the mental sort of suppleness that acts as the catalyst for the physical suppleness to arise, the body to become very serviceable. On the basis of that, you experience a physical bliss. And then the final step is the mental bliss that arises. So it just takes that whole unfolding for it into the physical, for it to then come back and to be experienced as bliss in the mental state. So he says, the next part, then whenever you enter meditative absorption, you have the experience of your body dissolving into the meditation device and nothing else appears to you, not even your own body. This is the experience of the great ecstasy of mental suppleness, the joy that we experience mentally. And the mind is so flooded with mental bliss that it is almost unable to stay on the visualization. This problem of the mind being flooded with bliss will clear up, and you then feel that the bliss has lessened somewhat. While in this state, though, you have gained the immutable type of suppleness that corresponds to the single-pointed concentration which always stays on the visualization. In essence, of course, at this time, you have attained mental quiescence, calm abiding. So again, there's this process of the mental suppleness being there, the mind feeling very serviceable, sort of free, like you no longer have anything that's going to weigh it down from doing any of the meditative work that you want to. And that induces this physical suppleness, a change in the body to where the body feels light as cotton. We no longer have this sort of heaviness, coarseness to the body, and the body is very serviceable. Then we feel bliss from that, and then again we go back into meditation. We feel a mental bliss that can at times be a bit overwhelming, but becomes more subdued as we continue our meditation. And then you carry forward this sort of, pliancy and serviceability, and you no longer have to, of course, engage in any of these other antidotes because you're free of all of that. Now, to get there obviously takes time, takes energy, takes effort. But once we attain that, we will have that state, and it can be used as long as it's sort of maintained. Now, all the great masters of the past have said that we've all attained these states many, many times. In fact, almost everything I shared with you today about these meditative techniques came from the Vedic traditions. This is what Prince Siddhartha studied with these great meditation masters when he left the palace before he attained enlightenment. So all of those meditative techniques exist even in other spiritual traditions. The problem is that they have to be united with wisdom, as I mentioned earlier. Developing those deep states of calm abiding, and then there are the 4 concentrations and the 4 formless absorptions, which I won't go into, but these are subtler and subtler states of calm abiding that we attain, where you develop the mind to an even greater degree. You go through all of that, and you might think that you're going to get liberated just through that meditative process. That's why the very topmost of these formless absorptions is called the peak of existence. There's a ceiling you get there. You can't go any further in making the mind even more subtle. And you end up hitting that ceiling, and there's no liberation. There's nothing that you can be liberated from, because each of these states liberates you from coarser levels to some degree of what we have going on in our minds. They become subtler and subtler. Not that you get rid of those in their entirety, you just are no longer having those manifest. Already at calm abiding, you have an unbelievable mind that is not going to manifest the grosser forms of delusions, because it's very, very subtle and none of that disturbance is arising. But there are even subtler states. But until you unite this whole process with special insight, with wisdom, you're not going to create the antidote to the ignorance that is at the root of our suffering. So all of today's instruction was hopefully to give you like a little bit of a map of what it looks like if you develop the interest and the desire to attain calm abiding, so that you have some awareness of where it all goes. Again, I wasn't able to go into great detail. I wasn't also able to go into this, which I knew I wasn't going to, but I want to share it with you nonetheless, is this wonderful little diagram that you probably have seen in various forms painted on tankas and what have you. This goes through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, going up, and then uniting that mind of calm abiding that you attain afterwards, which is the man on the white elephant towards the top. You unite it with special insight, where he's holding the sword, the ability to cut through all of that ignorance once one has attained this union of calm abiding and special insight. But there's a whole explanation of what the elephant means, and the monkey, and the little rabbit that's there as well. I don't have time to go into all of that. Sometimes I do longer course on that and teach all that, but it's a nice way to remind ourselves that we too can make that little progress through these different bends of the road and eventually attain that elevated state. So hopefully you've got some idea of what that looks like, and maybe a little more interest in pursuing that, so that you can overcome that laziness that keeps you from getting on your cushion and doing some meditation. But as I was pointing out, this is essential to have this if we're ever going to have this union of these two minds. The very stable mind that then can penetrate into the meaning of reality, the meaning of emptiness. So from here, we're going to go on to look at emptiness more in the next class. There are some readings again on your reading assignments. If you can do those in advance, that's great. If you want to do them afterwards, that sometimes is helpful too, so that you can review what I talked about by reading the chapters that pertain to that. Any questions from today? I realize it's already after 12:30. Were there any questions in the chat box? I don't think so, no. I know, again, it was a lot of words and a lot of information, but as I said, I hope it was somewhat inspiring to hear this and to know that this is, again, it's all laid out for us. We just have to do the work, which is often the case, right? This is what the Lam Rim entirely is about, right? Telling us exactly how we need to develop our minds, but it's up to us to do that work. So, all right, if there aren't any questions, again, feel free to, if you do have questions that come up afterwards, or if you've done the reading and liberation in the palm of your hand or whatever, and you think of things to ask, feel free to ask me. Again, I'm not by any means a meditation expert. I struggle with my own meditation, know that that's, often the case for most of us. It's a very hard part of our practice because we're just not familiar with it. That's why the continuity and the familiarity is so important, just to do the work, to do that time. Victor, were you going to share something?
Yeah, I have a very quick question. To
Sure.
avoid dullness, is it okay to open your eyes during meditation, or just half closed is a better technique or better way?
Yeah, thanks, Victor, for that question. Again, on the set of instructions that I will post out there, have Mary post out there, it does say to try to keep the eyelids partly open. As you mentioned, that's the general advice given, is to not allow the mind to get dull and sleepy by closing the eyes, because that's what we do when we go to bed. Nonetheless, if you are having a lot of kind of that sleepiness, tiredness, it can be useful to open the eyes even more. I know that there's one technique of meditation in Tibetan Buddhism, I think it's when they do Dzogchen meditation, where they have the eyes wide open. Like you might see pictures of Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava, where he has these like really wide eyes. And that's actually some meditation techniques. They want you to keep your eyes wide open and not be distracted, of course, by anything around you, but just to have that quality. If you are having a lot of heaviness and dullness, it's perfectly fine to open the eyelids more to bring them up. But if you find that then the opposite is happening, that you're getting distracted looking at things in the room, or whatever's going on, cats walking around or whatever the case might be, then you might want to bring them back down again. But this is again that balancing we have to do, finding just the right pitch on the string of the guitar or whatever. We have to find the right pitch in our own meditation. um, Sometimes we might try some of the other things first, raising the light in the room so that we have a bit more light coming in through the eyelids being still partly closed. And we might also increase fresh air, or as I mentioned earlier, put cold water on the face, get up off your cushion for just a minute, go splash water, make yourself, a bit more refreshed. But if you do all these things and you open the eyes and you're still like practically falling asleep, well, then you may need to get some rest. Sometimes that's, something we have to take into consideration, is that we might not be getting all the rest that we need so that we feel really charged in doing our meditation. So, all right. Thanks, Victor, for that.
Thank
Any
you.
other? Okay. Yes, Barbara.
Um, you had said that we have achieved this level of calm abiding many, many times throughout our lifetimes.
Right.
And I mean, I really feel like I'm starting from square one. So if our mind is continuous, where does it go?
Well, what happens, I think, I mean, again, I'm interpreting based on the comments that these masters make about us having done this before, is that we attain those states, but then again, we don't do anything with it. We don't unite it with any wisdom to do any real damage to what's causing our problems, the root of our problems, our ignorance and what have you. So if we don't continue to cultivate things that move in that direction, these skills fall away. And if you've, you know, attained those states, but you don't do anything that meaningful with them, very likely we could end up going to a lower rebirth, could end up being parted from these practices for many lifetimes. And so we always have to kind of go back in and start from scratch, because you're not maintaining a familiarity from life to life. This is why, again, a continuity of good rebirths, what we study in the small scope, is so important. Because if we have human lifetimes where we can continue developing this strong familiarity with these practices and these teachings and so on, if we're not able to attain enlightenment in this single life, which is hard for most of us to do, then we will have a greater momentum to not be able to slide back or lose these abilities that we, again, must have had many, many times over. you know so that's the understanding that I have on the basis of how they say that, is that we just simply didn't do what was necessary to do with those, and we lost them and haven't maintained a familiarity with them. So for, yes, every one of us, I think we feel like, God, I have to start from scratch here. I don't really have that good of a mind at all for focusing on things. And so we have to develop that skill all over again. Um, I know we do have that kind of confusion oftentimes when we talk about karma and the habits that we develop, and we might look at somebody and say, for example, the karma of generosity. They might have tons of money, but they might be the most miserly person we've ever met, right? They hold so tightly to their money, but in karmic terms, they got their money through being generous. So why don't they have a familiarity with generosity that leads them to be generous with money in this lifetime? It's because everything can be happening at many different times. We may have developed that 5 lifetimes ago, all that generosity karma that now manifests in a life where we have acquired the miserliness, and we don't really have the ability to do anything meaningful with that money, even though we spent great amounts of effort accumulating the karma for that, by being generous in other lifetimes. So it doesn't make sense sometimes when we look at it and think, oh, it should all just be continuing to move that way. But we're all over the place. We move this way in one lifetime, but then we end up down here, and then we do other things, and then that causes us to have to re-enter at the ground level, and then it becomes very complex. Karma's not linear, unfortunately. It's very all over the place. Okay. That's my understanding and the best answer I can give to it. Again,
Thank you.
if I was a Buddha, I could tell you exactly what was going on with your karma, Barbara, and I'd know my own as well. I'm just not there. Sorry. So.
Thank you. That was helpful, though. That was very helpful.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that, Barbara. Okay. Let's go ahead and dedicate. And if there are any additional questions, please hold on to them for next week. So let's get the prayers to dedicate. Again, recalling all of what we've done in this last 2 hours, all these seeds that we've planted through listening to these teachings with this motivation of bodhicitta. We now want to dedicate completely and fully for the welfare of all beings. So as we recite these verses, think that we're dedicating for the alleviation of suffering in the ways that are spelled out here, but also for all beings to attain perfect peace and happiness through all of our efforts here today. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. And we dedicate for the good health and long lives of our teachers, His Holiness, who we are using his book in this class. We want him to continue to give teachings, to be a guiding influence in this world for as long as possible. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, also for him to have the same results, as well as Osohita, Lama Yeshe's reincarnation. And we want to extend this out to all spiritual guides from whatever traditions. May they continue to abide in this world as well, to provide teachings to those who need their teachings. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then for Rinpoche, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then for Osohita, Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. Wonderful. So again, we'll continue with the emptiness teachings next weekend. I know it's Thanksgiving weekend, but with most people sheltering at home, I don't know if we're going to have, too many people who are away. But nonetheless, if you are away, know that everything will be recorded and you can watch the teaching later. But if you can do, again, some of the reading either in advance or afterwards, it's a wonderful way to supplement what I'm saying. Because again, I'm saying things in a very quick way, sometimes within a very short period of time, and it's hard for me to go into the degree of detail that's set out, for example, in Pabankar Rinpoche's text. But anyway, try to do the meditation on concentration if you can over the next week, and continue to do that. That's an important part of our practice as best as you can. So thank you all. Hopefully see some of you before Thanksgiving, but if I don't, a very happy Thanksgiving to you. Have a safe and peaceful holiday. All right. Blessings to you. Be well. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.